Yeah, historians, are not used to writing I look at this book as a sort of not only a historical exploration of why evangelicals came to Trump, right? Taking the long view, so to speak, thinking about, the last 50 years or maybe even the last 250 years, right? About American evangelicalism. So we tend to take the long view, why things happened the way they did. But I also see this book as writing from the kind of whether it be the center or not, I'm not sure, but this sort of evangelicalism, right? I am an evangelical Christian, and so it is a piece of sort of social criticism, right, or political commentary, if you will. And I've never written a book like that. Historians kind of like to lay out kind of what happened, and then you draw your own conclusions, right? Hopefully we trigger your moral imagination or your political sensibilities in some way, and then you do something with you go do something, right? You decide what to do with the information you have. This is very different because I am actually being somewhat prescriptive in the book. So is it a work of history? I've been asked this, is it a work of history? In a sense it is, because again, I'm trying to understand what are the long-term patterns that led 81% of American evangelicals to vote for Donald Trump in 2016. What were the factors, right? Social, cultural, economic factors that led to this. And I actually trace this all the way back to, say, the 17th century, right? But then, I'm also kind of suggesting that this may have been a bad decision for evangelicals, or evangelicals were not kind of true to their own identity by throwing their support behind this person. So that's been the struggle, thinking about how to do a kind of historically inflected piece of social criticism, right? Or using the past to kind of promote some kind of ideal, political statement about my tribe, right? Evangelicals and how they've responded to politics. Well, I responded as an evangelical. I responded just as a normal kind of political citizen of the country, right? I'll never forget election night. I was watching with my kind of laptop there, I was tweeting and so forth, and all of a sudden I can't remember which station I was watching, probably CNN, they started parading different pro-Trump kind of Christian leaders onto the screen. I started seeing retweets of people, I won't name their names here, but leading Christian, a lot of people who today I call the court evangelicals, kind of praise the Lord, right? This providential thing that happened. And I got sort of very angry that evangelicals would even consider kind of throwing their support behind this guy. Now, again, prior to the election, I kind of knew this was going to happen, but 81%, was a very high number, as I found out. I think this was a couple days later, and then, that it happened. Not only that it happened in such big numbers, but that I didn't think Trump would win. I thought, this will all go away tomorrow. Whatever you think of Hillary Clinton, I said this will be done with, and all of the writing that I had done and everything, maybe helped or something, but it didn't help. I mean, it was clear that evangelicals were behind this guy, and I think I tweeted out something like, if this is evangelicalism, or if this is what an evangelical is, I'm out. Now, the next day I find out that got retweeted a lot, and Jonathan Merritt had a piece in The Atlantic in which he quoted me. So then I'm getting all these emails, don't leave, or, these kinds of things. And then other people are using what I said to kind of saying, well, here's Fea at one of many who we can't tolerate this anymore. That evangelicals would throw their support behind such a person that represented nothing of kind of evangelical values, policies and values, right? Policy and character was the problem here. So that was my initial reaction. I was angry. I'll never forget going to church. I write about this in the book, going to church the Sunday after the election. And I come from central Pennsylvania. I live in central Pennsylvania. I attend a big evangelical church. Some might call it a mega church even. And there I am kind of singing my praise songs and looking around and thinking, 8 out of 10 of these people, maybe more in central Pennsylvania, where Trump carried over 70% of the county I live in, voted for this guy. It took me a while. It took me a while to kind of get over the initial kind of anger, betrayal that I felt. And I didn't think about writing a book, though, I think, until my kind of historical hat. I put my historical hat back on and began to say, well, what caused this? That's how I'm wired. I tend to, after doing this for a while, you tend to think historically about things. And I said, I still feel I have something to say to my fellow evangelicals because I think they took a wrong turn here. At the same time, I want this to be a respectable analysis, a historical analysis, and so forth. So I decided that I was gonna try to do my best to be a historian and write, why this happened the way it did, but also have, kind of say a word to my fellow Christians as to where they may have gone wrong. I felt betrayed for two reasons. One is the policies of Donald Trump. Now, I've been critical of other GOP presidential candidates. I was critical of George W. Bush. I've been critical I was critical of Barack Obama on things too. So, but the way Trump doubled down on things like race, on things like immigration, the nativism or the xenophobia associated with that, the way he would take his kind of, he often referred to the race, we have the Mexicans and the blacks, and this was often applied to kind of his policy decisions. So there seemed to be this kind of ugly populism that was emerging, which is very much tied to kind of a racial, kind of nativist fear mongering kind of, we need to protect our borders with a wall. So I thought none of these things mesh very well with my understanding of what Christianity is, evangelical Christianity is. So there was certainly the policy, right? And so on the other hand, you had the character issues, right? That evangelicals would sort of sell their moral authority to speak truth to the world for a handful of Supreme Court justices or this or that kind of social or cultural issue. For me, the fact that this man had a history of all kinds of, involved with the porn industry, he was crude, he disrespected women, the things he said about his opponents, we could go into specifics about that. I'm a believer that there needs to be a kind of some kind of moral fabric to a republic in order for the republic to work. Now, where you find that morality, we can debate that question. I've written a little bit about that elsewhere. But a moral republic needs some kind of moral leader, some person of character, and he was not it. And I think you could make an argument against him, not even a Christian argument. I mean, he's just not good for America. But yet evangelicals were so driven by their culture war, win the culture war, get the justices we need, elect the right guy. This kind of model, this playbook, I call it in the book, this playbook for winning the culture, that they were willing to overlook all the character flaws. And that was the second thing, of course, that bothered me. I think it bothered a lot of other evangelicals. I think that character issue bothered most evangelicals, whether they voted for Trump or not. But ultimately, the playbook, how to win the culture wars by electing the right justices and the right congressman and the right president, was so overwhelmingly strong and had been so inculcated, so indoctrinated into the way evangelicals today think about politics, that I should have seen it coming. I should have, I should have seen this, if you look at the past 50 years. Right? This was all building up to this point. Now, I tend to think of this as kind of a last gasp of the kind of old Christian right. I think that most of the people who voted for Trump are kind of came of age during the late 70s and 80s, when people like Jerry Falwell and the Christian right were kind of articulating this playbook for how to win the culture for the first time. I think the average Trump voter is 57 years old. So I do have hope, especially as I look at young people in Christian colleges, like Messiah College where I teach, who are much more interested in different kinds of questions related to justice and social ills and those kinds of things in terms of how they exercise their faith. But I think I hope this is, I think I see this as a kind of last gasp. I think in the book I call it, I occasionally teach a course on the Civil War, and some of your viewers might remember the last great last great engagement at the Battle of Gettysburg, Pickett's charge, where the Confederacy made one last charge, before they were and almost were successful before they were kind of beat back once and for all. And those who know their Civil War history know kind of the war kind of went downhill from that point. So I hope that's what happened. That's what's going to happen. That's what we're seeing here. But so as I looked back, I looked at the last 50 years. I saw all of these kind of grievances that evangelicals believed were happening, that whether they be kind of sexual politics, the abortion, ERA, the women's rights movement. Evangelicalism has always been a very kind of patriarchal culture. So, I think there's a reaction to that. I think there was a reaction to integration, racial integration, desegregation. I think there were prayer in public schools, Bible taking out of public schools, prayer removed from public schools. I think there's this perfect storm that kind of emerges in the 60s and 70s that prompts people like Jerry Falwell and others to sort of establish again this kind of political playbook to win the culture back. And Trump proved that, just how powerful that playbook really is and continues, was and continues to be, even to the point that someone like Donald Trump could win. Again, I'm writing primarily to evangelicals in this book. I think there will be a secondary kind of audience of American religious historians, people who are interested in American religion, who want to kind of take a peek into what evangelicals are talking about. I think there's some good history in the book, though, too. One of the things I try to unpack is show how there's always been a dark side to American evangelicalism. We can talk about the way in which evangelicals have been on the front lines of anti-slavery, social justice movements, international poverty relief, all of these kinds of things. And we need to celebrate that, I think. I'm not one of these people who, I am an evangelical, so I rejoice that evangelicals are doing these things. But there's also a dark side. Even as someone like, say, Lyman Beecher, who I write about in the 3rd chapter, even as he is fighting slavery, he's also one of the leading nativists, right? He doesn't want Catholics coming in and undermining his Protestant nation. So this story goes back a long way, and I think what Trump does is he appeals to the worst side of evangelicalism in its 200-300-year history, right? Every time evangelicals, are not sort of representing the true virtues of their faith, where they fail, right? I think Trump seizes on that history. This is a history that defended the institution of slavery. This is a history that had such certainty about what is true, and and the fundamentalist movement. I mean, this is a movement that prevented, didn't want certain kind of immigrants coming into the country. There's a long history of this. I like my fellow evangelicals to at least be exposed to that history. I think when ordinary evangelicals, lay men and women, think about evangelical history, they kind of celebrate this providential idea, right? God is with us, right? God is doing great things through people. And I think that's important. I think God does, obviously work in this world and uses people in this world, but also the reality of human sin, right? I mean, evangelicals are not immune, right? Obviously, if anyone knows better, right, it's an evangelical, right, who believes in this conversion experience to one saved from the consequences of sin, right, through becoming born again or becoming, accepting Jesus, or whatever that looks like. So I want them to see there is a darker side to the history that Trump is tapping into. Am I going to convince the 81% that they made a wrong decision? Most I probably will not, but I do believe there's some fence sitters out there, people who maybe held their nose and voted for Trump, and maybe they need to think through exactly. They may be open to thinking through a little bit more, in terms of what this man represents and what the policy decisions he is putting forth represent, and hopefully it'll force evangelicals, maybe force is too strong a word, but it might encourage evangelicals to think more deeply about political engagement. And when a politician comes along and says, let's make America great again, he's ultimately, or she, in this case he, is ultimately making a historical statement, right? So I think evangelicals have to be careful, right? When was America great? Let's go back and think about that, right? What does Trump mean when he says make America great again? And before you start using these evangelical catchphrases like reclaim and restore and let's get back to and let's bring back, the way it used to be, we need to think more deeply about what it was like back then, how it used to be. So I think even if the book kind of forces evangelicals to kind of rethink even their phraseology and how what they say when they enter the public sphere, public square, I think that'll be a contribution in some ways. I'll be happy if that happens. So I think race plays an important role in this book. I think that's a contribution here. There's a lot of reasons why evangelicals voted for Trump. Sexual politics, I think, is a big one. I think race is also an issue. There is still a certain degree of fear among white evangelicals, right? That not only African Americans, but Hispanics, America is becoming less white. There's been a lot of good sociology written about this lately, about the end of white America. So I think this is, the white evangelicals who voted for Donald Trump, the 81% of white evangelicals, are responding to these changes with a sense of fear, with a sense of nostalgia for a white world in which they held power. So I think this is part of the story. This is part of the appeal of Donald Trump. Let's try to, when they say let's make America great again, you talk to most African Americans, the best time to live in America is today, right? They don't want to go back. And I've had some great conversations over the years with African American evangelicals and worked with them on things. And I talk a little bit about them in one of the chapters of the book, about this idea that we are somehow a Christian nation that we have to get back to. No African American wants to get back to when we were supposedly quote unquote Christian nation. So I think this appeal, and again, you see it in the history, whenever there is some kind of significant cultural change, whether it be religion, race. I mean, I'm half Italian. When my Italian family came over, they were of a different race. They were Southern Europeans, right? They weren't WASPs. So the same kind of, same kind of racial rhetoric, as well as the anti-Catholic rhetoric steps. So whenever there's a cultural and demographic change in society, largely through immigration or some kind of, say, slave rebellion, where the slaves are threatening to overthrow the racial hierarchy of the South, sadly, evangelicals are always at the front of that resistance, mostly white middle-class evangelicals. And I think that's what you're seeing again now. Right, our culture is changing. We're becoming less white. We're becoming more religiously diverse. I think the 1965 Immigration Act, which allowed non-Western men and women into this country, they brought their religions with them. They brought their culture with them. And I think Donald Trump stepped in and said, in a very kind of conservative, populist way, which we've seen throughout American history, maybe most recently Pat Buchanan, but there were others, in the 20th century, and said, we are going to, we're gonna make you happy again. We're gonna give you the kind of world that you once knew as a kid. We're gonna make America great again. And I think that, so it's very much tied into these kind of racial, cultural, ethnic kind of changes. For a long time, evangelicals have been, if not leading, very much at the forefront of kind of racism in America. I would argue, historically, really more as an evangelical, I would argue, it's a failure of their, it's a failure of faith, right? I mean, I think evangelicals have these resources, all Christians have these resources, the dignity of all human beings. I think it's most important, but also evangelicalism specifically, right? I remember hearing Mark Galli, the editor of Christianity Today, talking about all these Christian scholars that appeal to the imago Dei, which is we've been created in the image of God, and thus everybody has dignity, everybody has worth. Racism is not an option, right? As a result of that, if everybody has dignity. And there were people in the 17th, 18th, 19th and 20th centuries who were making these arguments. So it's not as if I'm sort of taking my 21st century view on this and superimposing it on the past. There are others who were more consistent on this. But Galli said, for evangelicals, it even goes deeper than just the imago Dei, or it's more thorough than that, in the sense that if we believe Jesus died on the cross sort of for our sins, the redemption, all human beings are worthy of redemption in God's eyes, regardless of gender, race, class, and so forth. So it moves even beyond just the creation to the redemption. So I think evangelicals have an amazing set of resources in their faith to be able to overcome these racial problems. And for a variety of reasons, they just failed to do it because I think they're overcome by fear in many ways. They're overcome by, and this deeply rooted idea that somehow we are an exceptional nation, that God has blessed us above other nations, that we are a new Israel, right? In some ways, evangelicals still believe they're in this kind of contractual relationship with God. Americans are. Evangelicals believe that if we don't keep a pure Christian nation, we're going to lose God's favor in some ways. So I think that all of those kinds of really bad kind of historical assumptions and theological assumptions, right? Fear, I love the Marilyn Robinson quote that fear is not a Christian habit of mind, right? So there's these kind of psychological, theological errors, historical errors that get in the way of us kind of living out our faith with a sense of hope, right? With a sense of equality, with a sense of what Martin Luther King called the beloved community. Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of people, and there have been a lot of people who, after the election of Donald Trump, and I was close to this as well. I would even argue that at one point I was there, maybe for a few days. I tended to work out my kind of angst or whatever about this kind of publicly. So if you follow the paper trail, right, like 2 days after the election, I'm kind of saying, here's what I'm still thankful for, right? So I just gave a talk last week to the board of trustees of a Christian college, and they gave me the assignment. The assignment was this: what positive role has evangelicalism played in American history? That's a tough question for a historian, especially after, in the previous question I answered about the dark side, right, of evangelicalism. That's a tough question because we don't tend to kind of speak in kind of moral categories, right? It's good or bad, right? No, this is what happened and you guys parse it out, right? But I respect the people who have decided to leave evangelicalism. A lot of my friends have, and people who, or at least rejected the label, let's put it that way. some of my kind of official and unofficial mentors have said it's not useful anymore. Let's use the term evangelical or evangelicalism to describe still use it to describe a historical movement, a phenomenon, but it's become so politicized. So, you have also the examples of, Princeton's Evangelical Fellowship, their student group, they took evangelical out of their name. You see a lot of big mega churches, and I think this happened before Trump, but they're removing the term evangelical because it has such political connotations. I respect that. For me, and it's really was through a lot of discussions with my editor, David Bratt, on this. He convinced me that I'm actually in the process of defending the term in this book. I'm not willing to let it go to the politician, to the court evangelicals, or the 81%, or I think there's something about evangelical, the word, the good news, the gospel, the authority of the scriptures, the cross, that's worth defending and worth saving from the way it's been so politicized. So I think when you read this book, I think you'll still see me kind of struggling with this a little bit, because I've always been a kind of very uneasy evangelical since I converted. I would say got saved right at age 16. Right? But I've always been uneasy because I was formed in another religious tradition that also had a profound effect on my moral formation and upbringing. But while I remain uneasy with evangelicalism, I don't think I'm willing yet to go all the way and say I'm not going to identify with that term. I think I often find myself, since the election, as much as I'm a critic of what the 81% did by voting for Trump, I get the hairs on my arm raised too when I hear kind of secular liberals or kind of just trashing evangelicals, right? I want to say no, or I get angry too at the kind of assault on evangelicals. A perfect example of this is after the death of Billy Graham. My natural instinct was to say this man lived he had flaws. We all had flaws. He could have maybe done more in certain areas, but this man, lived an honorable, God-fearing life, as I understood it. He had his slip-ups. I actually write about some of his slip-ups in the book. But I just thought the sort of secular, liberal, whatever you want to call it, the anti-evangelical assault on Billy Graham and some popular pieces was just way over the top. And they were making criticisms that no right-minded kind of historian would make, talking about the right and wrong sides of history, and Graham was on the wrong side. And these were people, a lot of them actually are former evangelicals with axes to grind. I'll say that publicly, I think. You know who you are. It's what fascinates me is, someone needs to do a study of how the election of Donald Trump influenced obituaries and other popular op-eds and stuff of Billy Graham. Because, some people are just connecting Graham to the court evangelicals, and there's some truth to that. But the venom in a lot of pieces on Graham kind of really got under my skin, and that's probably maybe saying more about me than them. I don't know, but that's an example, right, of where I will, some people are gonna think I'm enemy number one, public enemy number one after they read this book. But I just want to affirm that I remain an evangelical. I still believe in those things that evangelicals believe in, and I'm always going to be a critic too, right? It's sort of insider-outsider kind of thing. So for those who left evangelicalism, or at least don't want to associate with the term, I respect that. I'm not going to try to make a case. I write another book to kind of win you back, and I think that's a fair position to take. I'm just not I'm not one to take that position.